He didn't give you any. He didn't. It wasn't there. He just said it's coerced because I've reviewed this, just like you could review the transcripts and listen to the tapes and say, there's a problem with time. Do you need to pay a guy $300 an hour to look and see there's a problem with time? And I don't mean to make light of it, because it's a serious situation. It's a serious problem. But the defendant is the first one who mentions it happening at night. And then he reverts talking about it being in the morning. Why? Why he did that? Why he said that? I don't know. The testimony's been he's got significant memory problems, been huffing gas. I don't know. But when you analyze the way he talks in that tape, and you analyze what he said, you find he's not being coerced or manipulated. He's telling what he thinks is the truth about the time. And the most significant details of the crime he gets right. He says the problem is the suggestible questions. Now, if you've got a person, and whether he determined that this defendant was a suggestible person or not, I never was clear on. I never heard him say anything about that. Now, Dr. Wilkins did, but he didn't have any basis for it. Couldn't give you any basis for it. But he says the problem is the suggestible question, which to me sounds like a leading question. Kind of like, lawyers always jump up objecting if it's a leading question. Sounds about the same. Well, is a leading question coercive? Well, if the leading or suggestible question is coercive, you just say, well, that's not right. Like, whose car were y'all in? No, we weren't in a car. We walked. That's pretty easy to do. And the defendant did it. But if those questions are suggestible and the officers are manipulating this defendant, don't you think that he would be agreeing with them when they ask him a question that's leading or suggestible? And let's go through this. And let's look at these suggestible questions. Start at page 4. Detective Ridge, what occurred while you were there? Any manipulation, suggestion, or leading in that question? What occurred while you were there? And he answers. He tells them, I saw Damon hit the boy real bad. Anything suggestible or leading about that? No. Page 6. Have they got their clothes on when you saw them tied? That's the leading question. Suggests that they had their clothes on. He says, no. They had them off. From the photographs, it's obvious that they couldn't have been tied with their clothes on. They had to have been tied after their clothes were off. They couldn't have gotten their clothes off. So there, he doesn't buy into the suggestion, if you want to call it that, or the leading. Page 7. Where was he cut at? Or where did he cut him at? He was cutting him in the face. Anything that would suggest that he was being cut in the face. Now, they said, well, he might have been pointing to his face. Ladies and gentlemen, there's not one iota of evidence that took place. Not one. And you remember your oath. You can't base it on speculation. You can't base it on conjecture. It's got to be on evidence. And there's not any evidence that took place. Where was he cut at after he talks about cutting him in the face? At the bottom. Well, they might say, well, he was... After there's a reference to the groin area, and he says, well, they led him into saying the groin area. Well, the officer testified that when he said bottom, he's pointing at the groin area. But even if you want to say bottom, look at the photographs of Chris Byers in his bottom and see if it's not cut. And he asked, which boy was that? Talking about the boy castrated. That boy right there. And he points at this boy. There is no evidence that there was any suggestion made to this defendant about which one of these pictures to select. And, to believe that they did, there's no evidence of it. So you couldn't find that. But let's just say that you said, well, they did. You would have to conclude that these officers were so dishonest and twisted that they would pin it on an innocent person, a person they knew to be innocent. Then on page 10, has he ever had sex with them before? Talking about Damien and the little boys. Doesn't that suggest that the officers think that maybe Damien had sex with them before? And under Alshay's theory, the defendant should have said yes, and then tried to figure out what they wanted him to say next. He says no. No, he's been watching them. No, he hadn't been having sex with them. He's been watching them. In page 11, talking about the pictures. And this next thing is throughout this. It has these same three boys in it. Yes. And then Detective Ridge says, you're certain of that? Ask them that on a number of occasions after they've given a response that would be a response that's consistent with the facts. You're certain of that. Now, what did Alshay, what did he say when Mr. Davis asked him about that? You're certain of that. What does that mean? Do you think they're trying to lead him when they say that? Aren't they questioning his answer when they say that? Oh, he says that's to reinforce it. To reinforce it. These officers are skillfully manipulating the defendant, and this is to reinforce it. Well, when we get over here, in the second interview, when we're clearing things up, he gets over here, and you know that the medical examiner testified about the injury to Stevie Branch's penis. What he called a suck mark or whatever you want to call it. And there are some little bruises across the penis that you could conclude are teeth marks. You look at the bruises. And the officer goes in there and he asked, did anyone maybe suck theirs or something? And Jessie says, not that. I didn't see nothing. Neither one of them do that. Again, the question's leading or suggestible or whatever you want to call it. Does he buy into it? No. And then Inspector Gitchell says, you didn't see that. Jessie says, Gitchell again says, okay, did they pinch their penis in any way? Or were rough with it or anything like that? Jessie, I didn't see nothing like that, not rough with them. I just seen, and Gitchell says, you didn't see anyone go down on the boys the third or fourth time. Gitchell, are you sure? Is Inspector Gitchell now reinforcing an answer that's inconsistent with the facts? It's obvious the defendant just didn't see this incident. Now, when it works to the defense's advantage, all she says, if he asks, you're certain of that, well, that means you're reinforcing it. Skillfully reinforcing it. But when it's the other way, what is it? What is it? We're just asking questions. They're questioning, are you sure? When they ask, are you sure that Chris Byers is the one that was castrated? Are you sure? it's given him an opportunity to say something else. And he doesn't take that opportunity then, and he doesn't take it when they're asking him about this injury to the penis. In fact, this shows directly to the contrary of what Dr. Wilkins and Offshay say about the suggestibility. It shows that he is completely able to resist suggestion. There are a number of other times in there when similar type questions are asked, and I'm not going to go through every one of them. You can find them for yourself where there are apparently leading or suggestible questions that he doesn't buy into. He doesn't go along with. Then in the second tape, in referring to time, when he talks about 5 or 6, 7 or 8, Inspector Gitchell is questioning about that time. And finally he says it was starting to get dark. He abandons trying to refer to it by time because he has no concept of time. And he says it's starting to get dark. Page 4. Did you ever see the boys in the water? Suggestible, leading that yes, they were in the water. Jessie says, yeah, down by the water. He doesn't buy into it. Page 5. Did you see the Moore boy? Was he raped? Certainly suggests that he was, right? Leading question. The answer? No. Finally, in talking about the boys being sexually abused, Inspector Gitchell says, so they both did it to all 3 of the boys. Jessie, just them 2, as far as I know. The purpose of all this that I've gone through, and I hope I hadn't bored y'all too much, but Mr. Offshay testified and went over and over things that he claimed showed how suggestible this defendant was and how the police were manipulating this defendant. These are just a few examples throughout this transcript where what you might call leading questions, and by no means are all the questions leading, but some of the questions you might consider leading, where the defendant, as Mr. Holmes said, he'll straighten you out. And that's what he did. He didn't just cave in and have his will overborne. This expert, when it's the way he wants it to be, then it's police manipulation. But if it's to the contrary, he ignores it. And the best example of that is about him saying that, are you certain, reinforces it. When Inspector Gitchell asked, are you certain, on a question that he was stating that was inconsistent with the facts. Can't have it both ways. It's either reinforcement or it's not. And then, and we went through this. Now, why this very skillful expert testifier did this, I don't know. But he testified that night was not mentioned until page 18 when Detective Ridge said, the night you were in these woods. And if you'll remember, back on page 12, and you'll have that with you back there, the transcript and the tape, it was the defendant himself who first brought up night. Now why? All she tried to pass off to y'all that the police had introduced night, I don't know. Was he wrong? Just wrong? Mistaken? Doesn't have a grasp of the facts? Or was he misrepresenting to you? He then testified in regard to the follow-up tape that nowhere in the record does the defendant say 7 or 8 until Inspector Gitchell mentioned 7 or 8. Inspector Gitchell testified and explained where he got 7 or 8. And it was from the defendant's mouth. And then on page 3, again, why he did this, I don't know. All she tells you that where the transcript shows that Detective Ridge said 9 o'clock in the morning, while the transcript's wrong. That was Jessie that said that, according to Allshay. Listen to that tape. I don't believe you'll have any trouble distinguishing between Detective Ridge's voice and the defendant's voice. And it's clearly Detective Ridge saying 9 o'clock in the morning. Now, if these officers are going to skillfully manipulate this defendant after he says it was in the morning, why would he say 9 o'clock in the morning? Finally, in regard to Mr. Allshay, this is the same man that, despite all these flowery explanations for why this occurred, it's the same man who, in the state of Washington, testified that a man had given a coerced confession, a wrong, untrue confession, when his 2, not minor daughters, or mentally handicapped daughters, or anybody else, his 2 adult daughters, said that he had molested them. His wife said that it happened, and he said that it happened, and confessed to it, pled guilty, and not until the expert testifier goes and talks to him does he suddenly say, this is after more than 5 months of maintaining this guilt, that I'm not guilty. Were all these people skillfully manipulated and coerced into saying these things? Well, the state of Washington and their courts thought not, and discounted his opinion. The bottom line in this case is these officers' integrity. Inspector Gitchell and Detective Ridge, there is absolutely not one iota of evidence that they have told anything other than the truth in this courtroom. Anything other than the truth about what happened there, there is no evidence of that. There's no evidence of coercion. There's no evidence of them yelling at him. As Inspector Gitchell said, sometime you have to do that. In this case, it was not necessary. There's no evidence of any form of coercion. What's the defense? Are they saying that the defendant was brainwashed? Is that what they're saying? This defendant knew facts that nobody else knew. Now, when you look at these documents that the defense introduced, I believe it's going to be clear that he was given information nobody else knew. The newspaper, what they printed was that all the boys had been sexually mutilated. Well, if that's the information he had, why didn't he say, well, all 3 of them were cut in that place instead of one, and pick out the right one? Got a little report here from an interview with some guy named Kelly. Rumors. Castrated and mutilated, beaten to death. Did it say one was castrated? Mutilated? Anything about cuts in the face? No. And then another one. In response to the question 9, which is, how do you think they died? Pointed to penis, said her cut off. her it was cut off, and they were beat up. He didn't say it was cut off of 1 or 2 or 3. There's no evidence that who was cut or how many was cut was common knowledge. You've got injuries to the ears nobody knew about. The defendant described the way they would have happened. You've got injury to the genital area where he identified the specific person. Yes, there's information that all of them had that, and that was not true. That was wrong information. And he picks out the one person who it was done to. Injuries to the face were not common knowledge. Finally, we get to the Bojangles defense, which we've already talked about briefly. And use your common sense. The judge says you can take it back to the court, to the jury room with you. Is somebody that's going to go to all the trouble that these defendants went to in cleaning up that scene, are they going to then, or he going to then go into a public place and leave blood all over the place? In this system, we all have duties. Barbara's duty, and even though she's not doing her little typing thing, she's still taking everything down by tape recorder. In the courtroom, that's her job, is to take down everything that's said. The sheriff's office, to act as bailiff, provide security, and they've done their duty. Inspector Gitchell and his men investigated this crime to the very best of their ability. And keep in mind what the medical people said. Let me digress a minute. This was a clean scene. It's not like being in a house where the evidence is contained. This is outside in the woods, but yet not a drop of blood. They might say, well, it must have happened somewhere else, and they carried him in. There's no trail of blood leading out there either. And this guy going in Bojangles leaves blood dripping all over the place. Not any blood out there because it had been wiped down. And you've got the pictures, and you can see in the pictures the condition of that bank where it had been cleaned off. You've got the most destructive thing to evidence that you can have. Water. You got the bicycles in water. You got the kids in water. You got their clothes in water. And despite all of those problems, the forensic people at the crime laboratory were able to obtain fibers that matched both Damien Eccles and Jason Baldwin, despite all those problems. And they also found, and this was somewhat confusing, the testimony, at least it was for me. Some of y'all may be scientists or science people, but the testimony from Dr. or Mr. DeGuglielmo about the DNA. Now, if you'll recall, Kermit Channel from the crime lab said that in his test on the little boy's pants that he ran screening tests. He ran one screening test, and it came back positive for semen. He ran a second screening test, positive for semen. He looked under a microscope, and the pants were all muddy and everything, and he couldn't see any sperm, but he had these two positive tests for semen. So he sent those cuttings from the pants to Genetic Design in North Carolina. And that was the man from North Carolina. And what did he tell you? When you boil it all down, if I can boil it down, he tells you that in his opinion, the DNA that he found from those cuttings was from sperm. Did he see any sperm? No. Because he doesn't look at things under the microscope. His are DNA tests. He said, they asked him, Mr. Stidham said, are you saying positively that there's sperm there? And he said, well, no, you can never say positively unless you look under a microscope and are able to see it. But if I had done that, it would have used up part of the sample. And we were trying to preserve the sample. But with his opinion, with the test that he ran, if you'll remember, There's the epithelial, what he called fraction, and the male or sperm fraction. Remember the way he was describing how you split out the two when you've got more than one suspect and you split it out so you'll be able to divide them up? The epithelial fraction is the non-male fraction. If it's something other than sperm, it's going to show up in that, like blood. Well, when he got the DNA test back on the epithelial side, nothing. No DNA. On the male fraction, the sperm fraction, it was positive for DNA. And he stated that in his opinion, that this indicated the presence of sperm on those pants. So despite not enough to connect to this defendant, but it wasn't enough to connect to anybody. It's not as if you had something that just didn't connect to this defendant. It wasn't enough to connect to anybody because there's just not enough of a sample. So despite this clean crime scene, the forensic people at the lab and through the work of the police department, they were able to come up with that corroborating factor, the fibers that matched Damien and Jason. And then you got the judge, and back to the duties. Judge Burnett's job is to keep us all in line, and you've seen probably more objections and approaches the bench than you ever want to see. But those things, as Mr. Davis pointed out to you in voir dire, sometimes they're necessary, and we have to do those things. But his job is to be the judge of the law and to give you the law that you're to follow. Mr. Stidham and Mr. Crow, it's their job to represent this defendant. And they've done that. It's Mr. Davis and my job to present to you the state's case, and we've done that. And now we're about to enter the phase where really the job becomes yours. The entire job becomes yours. To judge whether or not, based solely and exclusively on the evidence that you've got before you, whether the state has met its burden of proving this defendant guilty of 3 counts of capital murder. I submit to you that the state has met its burden of proof. I submit to you that you should go back, deliberate, take your time. This is not something to rush through. Listen to those tapes and then return your verdict of guilty. Thank you.